I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Okay, rather than get depressed about this crisis, I should suggest that one thing the left has always been good at in the past is to actually have a materialist analysis of the crisis and to understand also the weaknesses of the other side, our opponents. And I think we're living through a period that Antonio Gramsci described very well, a period of many morbid political symptoms on all sides. I'm just going to talk about 3 points during this discussion, which I've got up there, and I'll go through them, including some lessons and some ways forward that I think we can look at. I think it's important to understand the ALP's crisis not just as one of narrative and ideology and so on, but actually of real material factors about the formation and constitution of the ALP. The trade union base of the ALP has really withered. It was over 40% density between 1914 and 1990. Now it's 18%. This was a real base of the ALP. Strike days are down. The party organisation, it's famous now how withered it is compared with what it used to be even 20, 30 years ago. The primary vote has collapsed compared with the historic past. Don't forget the Labor Party was out of office during the Menzies years, averaging 45.7% of primary votes, even with the DLP in existence. And now, look at the last 2 elections and where we're heading now. And most significantly, I think, and a really bright spot of the last 10 years, there's actually been a left formation, whatever its problems, outside the ALP, that the left has actually been able to draw inspiration from. The factions of the ALP have also lost their meaning. Particularly the higher you go in the party, the closer to government and the politicians. That real connection with the working class is not what it used to be. And so I think, as Sally described very well, there are some very unrepresentative fiefdoms. It's more about patronage than about social interests. And we have a formally left faction PM who attacks asylum seekers, single parents and so on. What's going on? So yes, the party has lost its ideological reason for being. It's really hard to take Wayne Swan seriously when he attacks mining bosses at the same time as helping design the MRRT, which hits them with a feather. But all those problems of narrative and ideology have to be understood on the basis of something real and material. Labor Party's had ideological crises in the past, but never has it been so deep and dramatic. And it's a crisis of political representation. And I would argue that actually Labor's greatest success of the modern era, the Accord period, was its undoing, because its success was a neoliberal success. And you look at that graph is of the trend of wages in Australia, average male wages in Australia, and you'll notice that once the economic crisis of the 1970s starts, actually this rising wages situation falls apart. And in fact, if we're really honest about it, wages do worse under Hawke and Keating than they do under Howard. Now, I'm not a defender of Howard, but we have to think about what the implication of this is, of a progressive reform agenda that was promised as part of the Accord, but what wasn't actually delivered except for a few things that people keep talking about, like Medicare. In fact, even superannuation, given its returns and given the financialised industry it created, you have to wonder how progressive a reform that really was for workers. And neoliberalism is hardly a popular set of policies. Here's polling from Essential last year. Thank God for Essential Research, the best polling in Australia. Here are liberal national voters and their attitudes to who did well out of this period of great reform. Golly, 55% thought the corporations did really well. This is liberal national voters. So you can see across the community there's a real class sense that this project was not the right thing. And yet, the mainstream political parties want to carry on with it, want to, in fact, celebrate this golden age of reform. So Labor's going to lose the election this year, possibly horrifically. I'm starting to think 55-45 is not unreasonable. But it's actually the whole official political class that is having these problems. The ALP's crisis is currently worse because it has come off a long period of power in the states and, more importantly, federally. But actually the Liberal and National parties have a lot of internal problems. Let's not forget, Campbell Newman was the solution to a dire crisis of the LNP in Queensland. And the left has forgotten that it won in 2007 because Howard's agenda was so exhausted he got thrown out of his own seat. We've forgotten the great victory there because we've then looked to this government to deliver things. And as this crisis has gotten worse, both sides of politics, both unpopular, have looked increasingly to scapegoating to try to cover this up. You can't correct this by having a few nicer policies to, talk to the base. You can't correct such a deep crisis. And the crazy part is, it's not like people think that Abbott is going to be great. He's unpopular in all the polling. Essential shows that actually most people expect to be worse off under Abbott than they are under the existing situation. There's new marginal electorate research that shows that even though a majority of voters in marginal electorates are going to vote for the Liberals and Nationals, a majority also want a Labor government. So there's all these kinds of morbid symptoms. Here's some essential polling, really excellent stuff about people's expectations of Abbott versus the current situation. In almost every category, people expect things will be worse, including they will be, by a factor of 9%, worse off themselves financially under Abbott. So you've got to understand it's a crisis of official politics and not necessarily some kind of rational decision about who's got the better list of policies. And that's why Abbott is playing this small target strategy. He's holding together a very messy, very diverse constituency, a lot just united by being against this government. He knows he can't go back to Howard or implement the full IPA agenda. As he made clear at the IPA dinner the other night, he actually said, "I'm not going to be the Whitlam of the right." No, I think it's important because if we think he's all-powerful, then we instantly become demoralised and despairing and get stuck in worrying about that. And let's look at LNP governments. We've had 2 leaders overthrown, including one by phone call overseas, right? We have Campbell Newman in a lot of trouble internally. The fact the left hasn't had an electoral resurgence in any of those places doesn't tell you anything about the weaknesses of the right. Abbott is a thug, but his government will be weak and incoherent. And if you predict an Abbott apocalypse all the time, you just make people passive in the face of it. And is there a basis for new work choices? No, there's not. Look at LNP voters' opinions on penalty rates. Overwhelmingly, people think people should be paid, LNP voters think people should be paid penalty rates. Contract work. Who does it actually help? Well, vast majority of LNP voters think it just helps employers more than workers. But the ALP's morbid symptoms have been made worse by this period of government. It's attacked refugees, watered down the minerals tax, dropped climate action and then been pushed by the Greens to do something. Welfare crackdowns, the Northern Territory intervention, gay marriage, 457 visa, nationalism, you name it. This is a government that has played to the right. It has accepted the primacy of Abbott before he's even won an election. And the current leadership can't even claim its greatest true achievement, saving us from the GFC, because that's when it was most dysfunctional under a psychopathic leader. So what sort of confusion can you get out of this? And then it attacks Abbott for not being pro-market enough on climate, not being pro-market enough on paid parental leave. Is the ALP possibly now having its PASOK moment? This is a serious issue. The left, though, has dropped serious political independence from the ALP's project. The ALP left is caught up in that, clearly. Unions demobilised your rights at work and accepted a government that gave us work choices light. And the Greens, this is a more subtle process. The Greens haven't collapsed their program in the face of Labor, but they gave ground politically to Labor by entering a political alliance. They exchanged some policy stops and access for the kind of harsh criticisms they used to make of the ALP. And they actively demobilised supporters in the climate movement. They've thrown away, I think, their ability, something they need to regain, of actually standing against this crisis of the political class. And even now, they talk, well, Labor's really terrible. On the other hand, it was really good how we were in power with them. So I think to build a new left, just got 2 slides to finish off. We have to start by recognising the left can't rebuild while it accepts large parts of the neoliberal agenda. People want to hold on to bits of it as you can add nice stuff to it. We have to recognise there's a crisis of political representation, but we shouldn't join in it. We shouldn't make excuses for bad policies because our side is implementing them. There's been too much of that under this government. And we should develop a left program that doesn't subordinate itself to first getting the ALP and Greens into government. And really, we've got to start thinking about mass political action, the kinds of movements we saw in the early 2000s, the inspiration of your rights to work in the climate movement rather than governmentality. Because I don't think Abbott is the main danger. The main danger is, first of all, are we prepared for a global economic crisis actually hitting Australia? Are we prepared for when Abbott goes into crisis? Because like the left in Queensland clearly hasn't been prepared for Newman going into crisis, it hasn't been able to take advantage. It's really important that we've got to understand that ALP's crisis is so deep that we can't expect an automatic benefit to the ALP from a crisis of an Abbott government. And finally, and perhaps most worryingly, this partisanship is really bad, but it's not bad in terms of the general populace. Most of them aren't really pulled along by it, but there is a hard right constituency building. And I worry not only is Labor having a PASOK moment, but we could see a Golden Dawn moment down the track as well. And that's a real concern far above Abbott. Thank you.